I've been with Hartwell Systems for 22 years, and I still remember the exact sound the server room made at 2 in the morning. A low, steady hum that you either learned to love or it drove you out of the building inside of 6 months. Most people chose the second option. I never did. My name is not important. What matters is that I was the person who kept the lights on. Hartwell is a mid-sized infrastructure management company based out of Mississauga, Ontario. We handled IT architecture and systems integration for municipal clients, water treatment facilities, transit networks, a handful of regional hospitals. Not glamorous work, not the kind of thing you explain at dinner parties without watching people's eyes glaze over. But it was work that mattered, and I was good at it. Better than good, honestly. Though I was never the kind of person who needed a room full of people to tell me so. I started there at 31 as a junior systems analyst. By the time I was 40, I was effectively running our largest client account, a regional health authority spanning 4 hospital campuses across the greater Hamilton area. The contract was worth just under $32 million annually. I knew every integration point in that system. I knew where the legacy infrastructure was held together with what my old team lead used to call institutional duct tape, and I knew exactly how to keep it from failing. That knowledge lived in my head, and occasionally in documentation that I updated obsessively because I believed in doing things properly. I also, for 12 of those 22 years, had been doing the work of a director without the title. The pay, or, and this is the part that still sits in my chest a little funny, the acknowledgement. Nobody put a gun to my head. I want to be clear about that. I stayed late because I believed in what we were doing. I answered calls at 10 at night because I understood the stakes. When a hospital's patient management system flags an integration error at 2 in the morning, you don't look at your job description and shrug. You fix it. And I fixed a lot of things that were never officially my problem to fix. My director, a man named Philip, thick glasses, the kind of guy who forwarded emails and called it strategy, knew exactly what I was doing. He thanked me for it. Often. In that particular way that managers thank you for things they have no intention of compensating you for. For 3 consecutive years, I applied for the Director of Systems Integration role. 3 times the process went quiet, and then Philip would call me into his office with that look on his face, the one that means bad news wrapped in compliments, and tell me the timing wasn't right, that the executive team was looking for a slightly different skill profile, that I should be patient. The 3rd time, he told me they were restructuring the role entirely and asked me to help onboard the person they'd chosen instead. That person was a 29-year-old named Kyle. Kyle had a master's degree from Queen's, 3 years at a consulting firm in Toronto, and a father who sat on Hartwell's board of directors. He was personable. He wore good shoes. He had a handshake that suggested he'd practiced it. He knew almost nothing about legacy systems integration or the specific architecture our health authority client ran on, which he made immediately clear by asking me, in our first meeting, whether we could just migrate everything to the cloud over a long weekend. I smiled. I said I'd put together some materials to get him up to speed. I drove home that evening and sat in my car in the driveway for about 10 minutes before going inside. My wife came to the door before I'd even taken my jacket off. She knew before I said anything. She's been reading me for 27 years, and she doesn't miss much. They gave it to Kyle, she said. It wasn't a question. They gave it to Kyle, I said. She handed me a cup of tea and sat across from me at the kitchen table and let me talk. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I've turned over in my mind many times since. She said, "You've been doing that job for free for 12 years. Maybe it's time they found out what it actually costs." I didn't do anything dramatic. I want to make that clear too. I didn't send an angry email. I didn't complain to HR. I didn't sabotage anything or make Kyle's life difficult. I simply decided the following Monday morning that I would do my actual job. The one on my contract, the one I was being paid for. My official title was Senior Systems Architect. My official responsibilities were clearly outlined in a document I'd signed and largely ignored for a decade because there was always more to do. Starting that Monday, I did exactly what that document said. Nothing more. The first week was almost peaceful. Kyle sent me 3 requests for walkthroughs on client-side architecture. I responded to each one professionally and pointed him to the documentation repository. He replied that the documentation was pretty dense and asked if we could do a call. I told him I was slotted pretty heavily that week, but would find time the following Thursday. I left at 5 o'clock every day. I didn't answer messages after hours. I put my phone face down on the nightstand and slept 8 hours for the first time in what felt like years. My wife noticed. She didn't say anything, just made a slightly better breakfast than usual, which is her way. The second week, the health authority account started showing the first hairline fractures. Kyle had approved a routine update to one of the secondary data bridges without checking the dependency chain. It was the kind of mistake that someone with 6 months of hands-on experience in our system wouldn't make, because they'd have learned the way I learned, by doing it wrong once at 2 in the morning with a hospital administrator on the phone, that our legacy integration layer didn't tolerate certain patch sequences. The update broke the synchronization between 2 of the hospital campus's patient transfer systems. Nothing catastrophic. Nobody was in danger. But there were error flags, there were confused administrators, and there was a very unhappy account manager from the health authority named Gwen, who'd been my primary contact for 9 years. Gwen called me directly. She always called me directly. I'd given her my number 8 years prior during a genuine crisis, and she'd never had reason to use it for anything minor since. "Something's wrong with the Hamilton eSync," she said. "Your team pushed something and now the transfer logs aren't reconciling." "When?" I said carefully. "Kyle Ashworth is your account director now. He'd be the right person to." "I've emailed Kyle twice," she said. "It's been 4 hours." I paused. I thought about my wife's words. I thought about 3 years of performance reviews where Philip had used phrases like invaluable institutional knowledge and the backbone of our client relationships, and then handed the director's chair to a man who didn't know what a dependency chain was. "I'll let Kyle know you've been trying to reach him," I said. "I'm sure he'll get back to you soon." There was a silence on the line that told me Gwen understood exactly what was happening. "Okay," she said. "Thank you, Dan." I hung up and sent Kyle a message flagging Gwen's concern and the nature of the error. I kept it brief. I kept it professional. I did not offer a solution. The patch took Kyle's team 48 hours to roll back. 48 hours in which Gwen sent 7 emails, called Kyle's office 4 times, and I only found out about this later, sent a formal written notice to Hartwell's VP of Client Services expressing concern about service continuity. I heard about the VP notice from a colleague who sat near the executive floor. I nodded. I went back to my lunch. The third week, Philip asked to meet with me. He came to my desk, which was unusual. Philip was a man who convened formal meetings in boardrooms with prepared agendas. Him appearing at my workspace on a Tuesday afternoon meant something had shifted. He looked like a man who'd had a difficult weekend and a worse Monday. "Have a minute?" he said. We went to one of the smaller meeting rooms. He closed the door. He sat across from me and folded his hands on the table. And for a moment, he just looked at me the way people look at a leaking pipe they're not sure how to address. "The health authority account," he said. "What about it?" "They're flagging concerns. The patch issue last week." "I know," I said. I forwarded Kyle the details as soon as I heard. Philip looked at his hands. "Kyle is still getting up to speed." "I know," I said again. "There are 2 other integration flags that came in this morning from the Oakville campus." He paused. "You're familiar with the Oakville setup?" "I am." He looked at me. "We could use your..." "Philip," I said, and I kept my voice completely level. "I genuinely like to help. But those accounts fall under Kyle's scope now, and I think it's important that he have the opportunity to develop in the role. I'd hate to undermine his authority by stepping in. That's exactly the kind of thing that makes it harder for new directors to establish credibility." The words came out smooth and reasonable. They were also, I recognized, a nearly word-for-word echo of something Philip had said to me 18 months earlier when I'd asked why I was being passed over. Something about giving new leadership room to grow. He recognized it too. I watched him recognize it. "Of course," he said. "You're right." I went back to my desk and worked until 5 o'clock, and then I went home. Week 4 was when things got genuinely difficult. The health authority had a scheduled quarterly review with Hartwell's executive team, a standing meeting that I had run with Philip nominally present for the past 8 years. Kyle was now set to run it. He spent 3 days asking me questions I redirected him to documentation for. The night before the meeting, he sent me a 14-point list of questions about client-specific history and integration notes. I read the message. I thought about the 47 consecutive months where I prepped and run that review without being given a title that reflected what I was actually doing. I replied, "Most of this should be in the account history files in the shared drive. Happy to look at anything specific after the meeting if anything comes up that needs follow-up." The next morning, I arrived at 8, did my work, and at 10 o'clock I heard, from across the open plan floor, the particular quality of silence that follows a meeting going badly. Kyle's review ran 2 hours over. The health authority's team lead, a methodical man named Stewart who had been Gwen's predecessor and who I'd built a solid working relationship with over several years, asked questions about integration roadmap timelines that Kyle couldn't answer with any specificity. He asked about the outstanding risk assessment for the legacy bridge system. Kyle said he'd have to follow up. Stewart, according to Gwen, who called me afterward to check in, said that he'd like to speak with someone who could speak to the technical details directly. He meant me. I told Gwen I'd passed her message on to Philip. Gwen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dan, are you okay?" "I'm fine," I said, "just working within my scope." There was another of those silences. Gwen was perceptive. She'd been navigating large institutional contracts for a long time, and she understood people. "They promoted someone over you," she said. It was not a question. I didn't answer. "All right," she said. "I understand." I don't know exactly what Gwen said to her own leadership, but 2 days later, Hartwell received a formal letter from the Health Authority's procurement office. It referenced the patch incident, the unresolved risk assessment, and the unsatisfactory quarterly review. It noted that given the scale of the service contract and the mission-critical nature of the integrated systems, the Health Authority would be initiating a service continuity review, and that pending the outcome, they were reserving the right to trigger the performance clause in their contract. The performance clause, if triggered, would allow them to exit the contract with 60 days' notice. The contract was $32 million a year. I found out about the letter the same way I found out about most things that week, through the particular atmosphere of a floor full of people who sense something has gone wrong. The executive assistants moved faster. The VP's office door was closed most of the day. Philip walked past my desk 3 times without making eye contact, which was new. My phone, that evening, had 89 missed calls. Not 90, 89. I counted because it seemed like the kind of detail that mattered. Philip, Kyle, Philip again. A number I didn't recognize that turned out to be the VP's direct line. Philip again. Kyle twice more. Gwen, which surprised me a little, though I suspected she was calling out of genuine concern rather than crisis management. The VP's assistant. Philip at 11:40 at night. I put the phone on the kitchen counter, and my wife looked at it and looked at me, and I told her about the letter. She nodded slowly. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to go to work tomorrow," I said, "and do my job." She smiled. Not the sympathetic kind. The other kind. The one that means she thinks I might actually know what I'm doing. The next morning I was at my desk at 8. At 8:40, Philip appeared and asked me to come upstairs. Not to the usual boardrooms. Upstairs, the executive floor. The VP of Operations. A woman named Rosalind who had been with Hartwell for 30 years and who I had interacted with perhaps a dozen times in my career, always briefly, always professionally, was sitting at a round table with Philip and a man I recognized as the CFO. Kyle was not present. Rosalind got straight to it. She was not a person who wasted time. "We're in a difficult position with the Health Authority account," she said. "I think you know that." "I've heard," I said. "We need someone who can go into that quarterly follow-up and speak to the technical details with credibility. Someone who understands the account history and the integration architecture." She paused. "We need you." I looked at Philip. He was looking at the table. "I want to help," I said. "I care about this company and I care about that client. But I have to be honest with you, Rosalind. I've been watching this situation develop for a month, and I think it points to a structural problem that a single meeting won't fix." She waited. I've been doing director-level work on that account for 12 years, I said. I've run that quarterly review for 8 years. I've been the primary technical relationship with Gwen and Stewart, and before that with the whole procurement side. And 3 weeks ago, the company decided that work, all of it, was worth less than a different person's last name. I kept my voice even. I'm not angry, but I'd be lying if I told you the last month hasn't clarified some things for me about my position here. Rosalind looked at the CFO briefly, then back at me. What would it take, she said carefully, to keep you here and engaged at the level this account requires? I had thought about this. Not obsessively, not in a bitter way, but the way you think about something when the circumstances finally give you permission to think about it clearly. A director title, I said. Retroactive pay adjustment for the past 12 months to bring my compensation in line with the role I've been performing. An honest conversation about the account management structure going forward, and I'd want that conversation to include a realistic assessment of where Kyle fits, because I'm not interested in doing ghost work for someone else's title again. Philip made a small sound. I didn't look at him. Rosalind was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Give us 48 hours." I went back downstairs. I did my work. I left at 5. The 48 hours stretched to 60, which told me there were real conversations happening. On the third day, Rosalind's assistant called and asked if I could come back upstairs. The offer was real. Not everything I'd asked for. The retroactive adjustment was partial, covering 6 months rather than 12, which I negotiated to 8 before I signed anything. The director title was immediate. The account management structure was being reviewed, though Rosalind was careful with her language about Kyle. He was eventually moved to a business development role, which was honestly a better fit for his actual skills. The man could sell, he just couldn't build. I ran the follow-up meeting with the health authorities team. Stewart shook my hand at the door and said he was glad to see me in the room. Gwen, at the end of the call, said simply, "Good. This is how it should be." The service continuity review was closed without action. The contract renewed. I drove home that evening through the particular gray-orange light of a November afternoon in southern Ontario, the 403 moving at its usual crawl through Mississauga. My phone rang. It was my wife. "How'd it go?" she said. "It went," I said. "Title?" "Director of Systems Integration." She was quiet for a second, then, only 12 years late. 11 and a half, I said. Let's be precise. She laughed. It was the kind of laugh that carries a lot of other things in it. Relief, validation, a little bit of "we always knew." And I sat in that sound for a moment before the light changed and I had to drive. I've thought about that year a lot since. Not with bitterness, though I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a period where bitterness was available to me if I wanted it. What I think about most is the moment I decided to stop doing work that wasn't mine to do without something real in return for doing it. It wasn't a dramatic moment. Nobody was watching. I just sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and thought about 12 years of 2 a.m. calls and quarterly reviews and dependency chain fixes, and I thought, this has a cost. I've just been the one paying it. The thing nobody tells you about knowing your value is that it's not really about demanding recognition. It's about being willing, finally, to stop subsidizing someone else's ignorance of it. I wasn't angry at Hartwell. I wasn't even angry at Kyle, who was in over his head through no real fault of his own and probably knew it. I was just done being the reason the whole arrangement worked while being treated like a supporting character in my own career. That distinction between bitterness and clarity was the only thing that made any of it go the way it did. My daughter called me after she heard the news from her mother. She's 26, works in healthcare administration in Calgary, and she has a certain directness that I like to think she got from both of us equally. "So you just stopped fixing everything," she said, "and they finally figured out it was you fixing everything." "More or less," I said. "Dad," she said, "that's the most you thing I've ever heard." I didn't have a good answer for that. I just told her to drive safe and said goodnight. The server room still hums at 2 in the morning. I know because occasionally I'm still there, though less often now, and only when it's genuinely my problem to solve. Which, these days, it officially is. There's a moment I keep coming back to, not the meeting with Rosalind, Not the 89 missed calls, not even the day I finally signed the offer. It's the moment I sat in my car in the driveway after they told me Kyle had the job. No music on, engine off. Just the sound of a subdivision in the evening and the particular stillness of a decision forming without me quite knowing it yet. I wasn't a saint in any of this. I want to be honest about that. There were days that month when I watched Kyle fumble through something I could have fixed in 20 minutes, and I felt something close to satisfaction that I'm not entirely proud of. I had to look at that feeling and decide what to do with it. The difference between letting a natural consequence unfold and deliberately making someone fail is real, and I thought about that line more than once. What I chose, every time, was to stay on the right side of it. Not because someone was watching, but because the kind of person I wanted to be after all of this was settled still had to look back at how I'd handled it. That's the part nobody talks about when they tell stories like this. The integrity of the method matters as much as the outcome. I could have sent a bitter email. I could have gone around Philip, stirred up resentment with colleagues, made sure everyone knew I was being wronged. I didn't. I did my job, the actual job I was contracted for, with the same care I'd always brought to it. That restraint wasn't weakness. It was the clearest expression of everything I'd spent 22 years building. The understanding that your character is the only thing in any workplace you fully own, and once you compromise it for the sake of a grievance, you've given away the only thing that was ever really yours. What Rosalind saw in that meeting wasn't just technical knowledge. She saw someone who, when treated poorly, had responded with professionalism instead of chaos. That told her something about what I'd be like with $32 million worth of client relationship in my hands. The outcome wasn't luck. It was cause and effect, playing out the way it usually does when you're patient enough to let it. I think about Gwen sometimes. The way she said, "I understand," when I told her I was working within my scope. She'd been navigating large institutions for decades and she recognized immediately what was happening. She respected it. That kind of quiet acknowledgement from someone with no stake in your career is worth more than most formal performance reviews I've ever sat through. My daughter said it was the most me thing she'd ever heard. I think what she meant was that I'd been consistent. That the person who showed up in that crisis was recognizably the same person who'd been showing up for 22 years. There's a kind of intelligence in that. Not the kind that gets tested or credentialed, but the kind that knows what it knows and doesn't need a title to confirm it. And there's a perseverance in it too. The willingness to keep doing good work even when the institution around you isn't keeping pace. To trust that clarity and patience and doing things properly will eventually mean something. It did. Not always, not everywhere. But here, this time, it did. And I drove home to that November light on the 403 feeling, for the first time in a long time, like the math had finally come out right.